researcher and a student of the Australian geochemist, inventor and unified physicist Malcolm Bendall. So far on the channel, we have primarily just been covering the research and development of the Thunderstorm generator, Malcolm's waste energy recovery retrofit system, which is designed to be fit to the air intake and exhaust of standard combustion engines and larger power plant installations such as coal or anything that produces carbon exhaust waste. With the Thunderstorm generator, we are able to atomically reconstruct the exhaust waste stream, primarily existing of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and hydrocarbons, into oxygen and other more useful elements in this context. This is of course groundbreaking, and the Thunderstorm generator will continue to be our primary focus this coming year, as it's in the commercial pre-production phase and there is still a lot more testing and analysis actively going on there to cover. This is the transition technology that we are going to see mass produced first, but it's actually only stage one of Malcolm Bendall's plans for plasmoid technology. Today we're going to skip right to the end and talk about the final phase of Malcolm's technology instead, the direct matter to energy drive, or Vajra implosive turbine. The drive can be utilized as an anti-gravity propulsion device for use on land, in air, on or underwater, or in space. But it's not simply a turbine, it also has many other uses, just as an engine has far more uses than just transport. The Vajra implosive turbine is designed based on the same underwriting principles as the Thunderstorm generator: sacred, geometry, and frequency. So why haven't we talked about the direct matter to energy drive on the channel so far, and why are we now suddenly skipping forward to talk about it now? So a couple of reasons for this. One, Malcolm has just submitted the protection patents for the invention. He had significant and valid concerns about this one being locked up or blocked in some way, and he's much more willing to talk about it now that the patents are submitted. Two, I've had more time to study these subjects myself now, so I feel ready to start discussing them in more detail. I'm still a student, not a teacher, but I'm sharing what I can. And three, Bob Grenier of the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project just released a video called O-Day Control last week that addresses the elephant in the room around these types of technology. He acknowledges that the power of dueling vortexes can be used to destroy, and it has been used to destroy, and it still is being used to destroy. In fact, the knowledge of how to generate unlimited power has been suppressed for decades on this basis. Nikola Tesla discovered how to generate a force field that could disintegrate any plane or bomb. Essentially, he discovered a way to end all war. He wanted to give this technology to the whole world, but his gift was rejected, and he was defunded and his work suppressed. So Bob points out that we are being fooled. The means for unlimited energy, propulsion, and transmutation of one element to another is already there. It's being used against us to perpetuate endless war and scarcity, all the while under the pretense that the knowledge behind this technology must be suppressed for safety. And before we break down the schematics of Malcolm Bendall's direct energy to matter warp drive step by step, exploring how it functions and how we can use it, I'm going to play a couple of short clips from Bob's aforementioned video, O-Day Control, where he speaks a little bit more about the suppression of the science behind this technology and why it is time to finally let the cat out of the bag, grow up as a species, and move into a new and far more productive age of science. And to be clear, he's not talking about this invention we're going to be discussing specifically. He's talking about the processes that Malcolm is claiming are behind this invention. Here's these clips from Bob.
So, he's saying down here, endothermic cold explosion, 9th of April 1984, 94, 2004, 2014. Yes, my friends, they've had a means to destroy anything they wish on planet Earth very, very easily, including making nuclear weapons completely ineffectual, knocking anything out of the sky and knocking anything out of the sea. For 40 years. Why do we believe the nonsense that they feed us about what we should be fearing about? If they wanted to do this kind of stuff, they could just do it, right? Why should we fear? Stop the fearing. Don't buy into the fearing, okay? And I ask, stop the killing. And can we use this technology for the benefit of humanity, okay? We know we can process food with it. It does that. We know we can recycle materials that are much harder to recycle and more energetically demanding in other ways. Let's do that. Why don't we remediate nuclear waste? Yeah, let's do that. Let's stop having this boondoggle for millions and billions for numbers of centuries. No, let's just deal with it, okay? Let's deal with pollution of other forms and let's produce energy. And why not have propulsion as well? Okay, there might be some issues with the kind of interacting with things because of you're removing neutrino or relic neutrinos or whatever, but it's unlimited energy if you're just lifting a load of water up to the top of the hill and letting it go through the existing hydroelectric dams. There's literally no excuse except that it's deliberate, or we're just run by stupid people, really stupid and ignorant people. That's it. That's all I can conclude. This test was deep underwater nuclear burst. So this was a US test 100 miles north of Puerto Rico over the Puerto Rican Trench. And it shows this explosion of water column coming up. It's an underwater nuclear test. And it says that this is equivalent to the test that was conducted purely electromagnetically on the 11th of April, 1963. 1963. When I say this technology has been around since the 1950s, it's been around since the 1950s. Okay? But what we are showing you with Bingjin Huang's cavitator is exactly the same forces are produced by cavitation. Exactly the same. And they are doing gentle nuclear transmutation, leading to synthesis of potentially elements you might want without chopping down a mountainside, right? Or potentially energy that you might want, or potentially decontamination that you might want to do with Roy Ishinamasa's vibrator plates. Put them in those tanks in Fukushima and stop dumping it into the sea. Thank you very much. Of course, the sea has got cavitation, blah, 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 but this is a way to just make sure it's not going into the food chain, right? It's real. We have 100% categorical proof that the same thing that occurs in those nuclear bombs, but in a completely uncontrolled way, is being achieved in a controlled way because we understand and can work with whirlwinds. We understand and can work with whirlwinds, but not to kill people, to do work to benefit humanity and the biosphere. Yes, okay. So Malcolm is very concerned that certain people are trying to get into a position where they could either discredit or cause Malcolm some misfortune, let's put it that way. So he's moved faster on his propulsion technology and has submitted the patent today. And since it's been submitted, there's an argument as to whether that can be published. So that might happen very quick to protect the information in the same way that Ken Shoulders protected it. We're really at the end game here.
And also, we'll just play another short clip now from Malcolm speaking about this in a Q&A live stream on the Martin Flash Memorial Project YouTube channel, also just a few days before this.
Truth. S23 says, question, how is this thing being received by the powers that be, and or do they already have this information technology? Malcolm.
Absolutely, they have it, and they've had it for 65 years. They've had it for 3,000 years. They've had it for 150,000 years. Somehow, someone, somewhere, through time, space, has been quashing these fundamental forces of nature. The most powerful in every religion and every culture in the world. This is the path, the most powerful machine in the universe. So the fact that it's being actively suppressed tells its own story. And then, in a way, I think our victory has been, the goal, from my point of view, is really, fundamentally not about the thunderstorm generator or direct matter to energy drive. It's about the awareness that plasmoids exist, Shamir exists, EDOs exist.
I think definitely. I don't think the genie can be put back in the bottle for people that are paying attention. But we've only got 10,000 people on YouTube, and I've known powers that be kill more than that in a couple of days. So it's just they are spread out all over the world. So
thanks, Bob.
It's going to be logistically very hard. Okay, so.
Yeah, Malcolm, we'll let you know if we see a laser moving across your forehead on the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, I'm expecting lots of those. I may have even got a mirror coat being made in readiness for the Cosmic Summit, just to reflect the lasers directly back.
I need to get so they to move defeat the Havana rays.
Sorry. Like I say, the first person I see with a tinfoil hat, specifically an aluminium foil hat, at the Cosmic Summit, I owe them a beer.
All right, so you can perhaps get a sense of the gravity of the matters that we're now speaking about. Keep in mind that it's a mildly uncomfortable situation to still be one of the only people online covering the science behind these ideas in depth, as simplistic as my videos still are. So I want to thank everyone who heard my call, and Bob and Malcolm's and others' calls to share these ideas more widely. I've seen images and footage from my last videos and clips of Randall Carlson and Bob Granier floating around on other people's channels and on YouTube and on social media like X. So this is really awesome. Whether you have a large audience, a tiny audience, connections in media, or you're just trying to convince your disbelieving mates down at the pub, or even better, your disbelieving physics teacher, it's making a big difference. People are hearing about this. Malcolm and Bob are working primarily open source for a really good reason: safety, and to ensure it gets out there for real this time. So we do need, of course, to see this technology commercialized and mass-produced and used too. All angles must be covered. The Thunderstorm generator is already going through the pre-production, prototyping, and testing phase of this process. You can get in touch with Alpha Prospects if you're interested in the commercial or investment side of things. And I know a lot of people want to discuss this with me personally, but I'm not a representative for Alpha or Strike. I'm a student of Malcolm Bendel's, and I'm an independent researcher just chasing the pursuit of knowledge and open sourcing everything I can on the way. So I'll need to direct those inquiries directly to the commercial licensees. On the other side of the coin, and this is the effort that I'm attempting to aid in here, everyone needs to understand how implosive technology works, or at least just know that it exists, so that we're ready for it when it comes en masse, and so that this knowledge cannot just disappear again this time, as it did in the case of Nikola Tesla, Stanley Meyer, and a number of others who discovered the secret at some point. Or alternatively, be falsely debunked in an effort to continue the suppression of these ideas within mainstream academia. And this is why Malcolm is quite happy to open source everything as he goes. He's taking precautions with protection patents, and he's also making every effort on the commercial, government, and industry side. But at the same time, he is open sourcing pretty much everything as he goes. He wants people to understand what this is and how it works, and for it to be as public as possible. So this is the only way it will get out for real this time. You can be a part of that effort. Malcolm Bendel and Bob Granier have taken the heat really for us here. Now help keep them safe. Share. You're welcome to use clips or footage from my videos to aid in this effort. Just credit or link back to the channel or to Strike Foundation, where I've taken many of the slides here to use myself. That would be appreciated. So thank you for your continued support. I appreciate it. All right, here we go. Let's get back to the heart of the matter. Malcolm Bendel's direct energy to matter warp drive for land, air, sea, and space propulsion, power generation, and atomic reconstruction, and a number of other things, called the Vandre Implosive Turbine, or MSART Plasmoid Engine for short. MSART being modern sea arc atomic reconstruction technology. It also has some other important uses, including being an integral part of the Bendel-Tesla World Power Plant design for unlimited free power, which we will talk about a little bit later, just in short. We will watch this short introductory clip from a video that Malcolm and Strike has produced some time ago. You may have already seen this floating around on YouTube or on Strike Foundation's website. It's been up for a while. This visually introduces the main concepts of the drive. And afterwards, we'll get a little more into detail with some of the diagrams. We will take a look at the patent submission, which I've been sent a copy of, and we'll talk about how this technology can be used and what the implications are. And also we will provide some further supporting references and material regarding these processes from other researchers. So here is the introduction clip. Credit goes to Strike Foundation for this one. You can find it on their website.
The underlying principle of Malcolm Bendel's unified field theory is that all elements are plasmoids, and that all those elements are directly controlled by charge density, therefore making charge density the only relevant characteristic when considering zero matter, time, light, and matter. The implosive vortex waveguide is inspired by the molten sea Vajra based on Malcolm Bendel's scientific observations drawn from his Bendel torus. This led to his unified field theory, which is clearly illustrated by his model of the elements and his octave dimensional model. The Bendel turbine has direct applications to all current technologies, but especially to the jet turbine and space propulsion industries. The Bendel turbine manipulates the movement of air using a structured waveguide to create an implosive vortex. This vortex, once established by the waveguide, becomes self-structuring, self-organizing, and self-perpetuating around a pole emanating from the zero point of the model. This effect induces a vacuum, which is the defining operating parameter of the turbine. The airflow, which creates a clockwise imploding spiral vortex, centralizes and compresses the oxygen and fuel, which is then combusted to create a fire tornado, producing internal heat and an external vacuum. A conventional jet turbine directs the heat generated onto the blades, which in turn creates differential expansion. In contrast, the Bendel turbine directs the heat away from the blades, whilst the incoming air cools the system, creating a boundary layer that insulates the blades against the radiant high temperature emitted from the compressed fire tornado vortex core. This is equal to the effects demonstrated by the plasmoid Thunderstorm generator. A conventional jet turbine blade has a high-pressure boundary layer that generates friction and therefore heat, whereas the Bendel turbine fire tornado creates a central vacuum, which expands out beyond the turbine blades and has the effect of causing the air in front of the Bendel turbine to be sucked into the central vacuum. The vacuum creates a minimal boundary layer effect, reducing friction and cools the turbine. The differential expansion doesn't matter on our blades because there is no inertial stress. The Bendel turbine, having no axle, turbine blades fixed to a shaft, bearings or moving parts, does not generate inertia and therefore does not subject the turbine blades to the destructive forces of heat and metal fatigue. In a conventional jet turbine, when subjected to both heat and pressure, the differential expansion inevitably leads to a deformation of the blades. This is due to the non-homogeneous casting and forming of jet turbine blades, combined with the weight differential between the boron, magnesium and aluminium alloy components, or composite materials where used. This differential deformation will result in an unavoidable imbalance, manifesting as a vibration of the turbine, especially when amplified at peak load. In contrast, the Bendel turbine blades are stationary and operate as static mixers of fuel and air, structured and directed by a waveguide of intelligent design. This means that the weight of the Bendel turbine is an order of magnitude less than that of a conventional turbine design. Another major feature is that the engine moves into a vacuum instead of pushing into a body of air. When we apply plasma in quadrature to the zero point of our fire tornado, it combusts any remaining material and adds effective electron thrust, creating an afterburner effect.
All right, let's break this down. This is ultimately not that different in principle to how the Thunderstorm generator is working, and I have many videos breaking down how that works and going in deeper into the structure of plasmoids and the form and function of the Thunderstorm. So if you've been following along with this, you should already understand rudimentarily what is going on here with the Vajra implosive turbine. The secret is the Vajra, the great thunderbolt weapon held in the hands of Indra and Zeus, used to protect the earth in the great histories of several different ancient cultures. The Vajra is a sacred geometric form which was employed by the ancients in the construction of temples, cathedrals, and even in the Ark of the Covenant, spoken of in the Bible and once stored in Solomon's temple, as well as the Vimana flying crafts of the demigods, spoken prolifically of in the Vedic scriptures, the ancient history books of Bharat or India. All of Malcolm's inventions work on the same principle, and he employs this principle fractally, sacred geometry, how to form a thunderstorm with a zero point at the center of two opposing vortexes and accelerate or reverse time. The Vajra implosive turbine direct matter-to-energy drive is the ultimate evolution of this principle. The Thunderstorm generator essentially utilizes the same processes to produce its results, but it's a simplified transition technology. The Thunderstorm generator Vajra is far easier to construct, and because it still involves some form of conventional fuel, it means that oil and automotive industries don't need to go broke while the world transitions if they would like to play ball. It's a transition, but the principles behind represent the science behind far greater technologies. So we'll eventually see them, be using them, and we should now begin to start understanding them. Now, this is a truly horrible example to need to give, but it's a good one. I want to give the disclaimer that I am a pacifist. I abhor war, and I see absolutely no need for it in the future. What's past is past, and I mean absolutely no disrespect to the brave individuals that have fought to protect what they believed in and to protect those they loved in dire circumstances. But the future is humanity's to claim. We do not need to act like Neanderthals, killing one another needlessly forever if certain basic needs are fulfilled around the world now. Nevertheless, it's a good example, and it gets the elephant in the room out of the way at the same time so that we stop using sacred geometry to destroy the world and instead use it to save it and propel humanity into a new industrial and spiritual age of enlightenment. In his recent video that we've already mentioned, O-Day Control, Bob discusses the fractal toroidal moment in relation to the process of what happens when an atomic bomb is dropped. The bomb is detonated at a point above the Earth to cause maximum destruction, and we can see quite clearly in the following declassified video footage where Bob has overlaid his fractal toroidal moment geometric model over the top and how an implosion really works. And like I say, this is a truly terrible example to demonstrate. It's an uncontrolled abuse of knowledge, and it shares no true relation to how the principles are harnessed and utilized in the technology that we're speaking about today. Which does not cause destruction. It is clean and has absolutely no nuclear byproducts, at least when used correctly. The atomic bomb is just an example of using an implosion to cause a significant explosion. Just like how we can choose to harness explosion itself to either power a car or to blow up a bridge. Implosion can be similarly used for good or evil purposes. But the implosion itself does not need to be followed by a violent and uncontrolled explosion, as was the case with the atomic bomb. Instead, we can safely harness implosive force in a completely different fashion and utilize it for propulsion, power generation, or the atomic reconstruction of one element to another. With all of that in mind, here's the clip from Bob. You can catch the full video on the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project YouTube channel, link in the description.
This is Boom 2
Internal
video.
pressure is measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. This pulverizing shock wave forms a dust pedestal which seems to follow the rising cloud, developing into the characteristic mushroom shape of a low-altitude burst. Losing brilliance rapidly, the fireball is colored an orange-brown by the release of oxides of nitrogen from the surrounding air. Turbulent and still glowing, it shoots upward with an initial velocity of more than 100 miles per hour.
You ready? You ready? Here comes the apple again.
The destruction caused by a relatively low-yield weapon can result in many square miles of ruins and account for thousands of human casualties. But how did it all come about?
Let's see that again.
This pulverizing shock wave forms a dust pedestal which seems to follow the rising cloud.
Seems to. The dust pedestals, it basically doesn't, the ground is pulverized. It's pulverized by the shock wave coming out from the blast. But as soon as the apple is formed and the charged particles start going around in a magnetohydrodynamic fashion, and because it is a full torus, effectively, it will produce a toroidal moment. It'll then be sucking in all the available, in my view, relic neutrinos that would otherwise cause a gravity effect. And this is the azimuth through which they are minimally able to pass. And therefore, anything down here can only really go up because it's still pulling the material. Like this is like a monopole. Everything's going into this point here. Okay.
Developing into the characteristic mushroom shape of a low altitude.
Of course, this is more like a column than a spread out thing, although you can see a little bit here. It's a column because this is a full tor, you know, with many subtors in there making the current structures.
This pulverizing shock wave forms a dust pedestal which seems to follow the rising cloud,
You see how it works within here and so forth?
developing into the characteristic mushroom shape of a low-altitude burst.
Okay, we have another one over here.
The destruction caused by a relatively low-yield weapon can result in many square miles of ruins and account for thousands of human casualties.
Now, I want to dial that back to here.
So this can give us a deeper understanding of what harnessing unlimited energy from the 0 point really means. It does not mean that we pull energy or matter that does not exist out of some kind of pool through a wormhole to another dimension. So this is kind of the case in an allegorical sense and almost a literal sense too, but you've got to think about things in a lot of different ways to make sense of this. Because two opposing vortexes and a 0 point, they sure can structure and process matter and energy in a way that would generally require what we would think of as more power to achieve. But the power is already actually there. There are no isolated systems in physics. We already have access to the unified power of the ether from all points. The question is only what geometry and structure can harness this potential energy most efficiently. And we should all perhaps know the answer to this by now. A 0 point or a black hole occurs on the plane of inertia, the point of equilibrium between two counter-opposing vortexes. There is no time by default at the point of equilibrium between the two vortexes. The plane of inertia is this other dimension that's spoken of so esoterically. But the 0 point doesn't contain energy itself, so to speak. It's all time and no time, 0 and 360. Instead, it atomically deconstructs matter, subtracts time, and reconstructs matter, adds time, as it passes through this plane. As Malcolm's been saying all along, sacred geometry is the true key to all of this. We can use sacred geometry to reconstruct a waveguide and apparatus which could harness these forces in a controlled and safe fashion for positive means. It can be as simple in engineering as the Thunderstorm generator Vajra, or as complex as the direct matter to energy drive Vajra. The whole of the science is in the geometry. This is an atomic reconstruction process, but it's not nuclear. There are no nuclear or unsafe byproducts produced when implosion is harnessed in this way, and a violent explosion will never be the end result. This is subject to further testing, but this is what everything so far suggests. We can safely harness and utilize this. It's always just going to implode, not explode. If we utilize geometry correctly and we aid nature, creating paths of least resistance for her to work rather than working against nature as we do in explosive or nuclear processes, 100% of the energy is utilized in the reaction, stripped apart, employed directly for propulsion and other means. So back to the power of the 0 point, there is a subtle difference to understanding this, but it is the best I can do to make it clear. The power of the 0 point does not exactly lie in the 0 point itself, like some well of potential energy. It lies in the sacred geometric structure of the self-contained and self-sustaining magnetodielectric field that is formed, which is, by the inherent power of its form, it has the ability to continuously deconstruct matter, light, sound, any form of AC field perturbation, and to convert this directly to direct current energy, as long as the geometry and the structure is maintained. Everything we experience is energy. Sound, light, color, matter, all of it can essentially be used as fuel if we wish. Will we run out of energy or end up vacuuming up our whole world to feed our engines? Take a look up at the sun and answer that question for yourself. No, we will not. There is quite enough radiant energy to be going on with for a whole civilization. Unlimited, in fact. This is why Malcolm's drive can be used for space travel. It doesn't need a specific fuel. You can put a specific fuel in it if you would like to just clean up a waste product, or in a specific use cases. There is a fuel and electrical injection apparatus included in the designs, as you'll see, but it doesn't need any fuel to run once it's going, or even to start necessarily. We have unlimited matter and energy available all around us at any point in our universe. The ether, the unified field, in motion in all of its various manifestations of frequency. This unlimited matter and energy can be utilized by forming a conjugate magnetodielectric field structure, a plasmoid, or simply a thunderstorm, which can then structure and process matter and energy in a way that is fit for the design purpose, such as propulsion. Anyway, I hope this example demonstrates better how the concept of generating 0 point power works. maybe we can try and use it for constructive and life-sustaining purposes rather than destructive ones this time. Now that we've covered this fundamental principle, implosion, let's take a look at the models and the diagrams of the Vajra implosive turbine from the PowerPoint used in Malcolm's lecture series over on HowTube. Remember, you can check out that full 15-part lecture series yourself. I've put the link in the description. And we will first run through the parts of the modules of the turbine, and then we'll go back through and explain the whole process. And I'll also be referencing the patent submission when it's relevant, especially later on. All right, so here is the side cross-section view of the model. We saw the short animation of how this flows together earlier. But if you don't remember, the input for the air and the plasmoid firing apparatus is on the right, where we see the swirl waveguide and the capacitor bank encased in the conical waveguide. And on the left is the toroidal electron scavenger and the output encased by a metal cowl, just like any commercial jet turbine. And the implosive turbine has no axle. The blades or plates of the turbine itself, the implosive vortex waveguide, do not spin. However, there are several other non-conventional moving parts, including the plasmoid firing mechanism and the spinning copper disc, and the air swirl vane surrounding the Vajra implosive vortex waveguide can also be used spinning under certain conditions too. We'll discuss that in a little bit. Instead of spinning blades, as in a conventional turbine, the Vajra implosive turbine uses the structured waveguide to manipulate the movement of air and matter, forming an implosive vortex. This vortex, once established by the implosive waveguide, becomes self-structuring, self-organizing, and self-perpetuating around a pole emanating around the 0 point of the model. This effect induces a vacuum, which is the defining operating parameter of the turbine. The airflow, which creates a clockwise imploding vortex, centralizes and compresses the air, and plasmoids, fuel, or other forms of matter utilized, which is then combusted to form a fire tornado, which produces internal heat and an external vacuum. A conventional turbine directs generated heat onto the blades, which in turn creates differential expansion. Most of the engineering of a conventional turbine is focused on dealing with this problem. In contrast, the Vajra implosive turbine directs the heat away from the blades, whilst incoming air cools the system, creating an insulated boundary or isolation layer that protects the blades from the internalized heat of the fire tornado. So here's a breakdown of the complete model where we can see each of the individual modules that make up the drive. Starting from the left of the diagram, the output of the turbine, we have the cowling. And like I say, not much different to what we'll find on a conventional jet turbine, Malcolm says. So next, the electron scavenger and the high voltage electrical conduit, represented with a colored cross-section of a toroid with 16 mirror planes, and we'll get back to look at this later as it is the end of the process. Next, we have the thrust guide, which houses the air swirl vane, and then the air swirl vane itself, along with the waveguide aperture control, and then the air swirl vane itself, along with the waveguide aperture control. And we can see better how all of this fits together in the previous diagram. The swirl vane is nested into the thrust guide and cowling around the implosive vortex waveguide. The swirl vane vacuums air in a clockwise contracting vortex as it enters the turbine. And I believe the vane is intended to be used static when used for space propulsion, potentially some air propulsion, but it can also be used spinning to assist with forming a vortex in water or air. The waveguide aperture control part underneath is also intended to guide and structure the sustained vortex that is formed and the subsequent energy that's harvested. And this is adjustable proportionally to the implosive vortex waveguide. And Malcolm notes that it functions similarly to the aperture of an old iris camera. So going back to the swirl vane, this will be made from ceramic or polycarbonate material, essentially a dielectric material that will repel charge, or depending on the geometry, will allow charge to run along their surface and accelerate, as is the intention here. So we do this again by using the principles of sacred geometry, and this will require digging much deeper into Malcolm's plasmoid unification model to fully understand. That is something we will be doing in future videos, but for now we'll just continue to explain the basic process first. Mounted inside the swirl vane and thrust guide is the implosive vortex waveguide, and this is essentially the turbine itself. These are the blades that do not spin. The unique geometry of the implosive waveguide is what structures and sustains the implosive vortex, which occurs at its center. So we can see how this works again in this diagram here. And the points of this waveguide terminate in 4 electrode emitters. These electrodes fire at the center of the vortex in quadrature and pulses as the blades of the waveguide charge and discharge. And we'll get back to this part soon. I'm just giving an overview of each part for now, but we will go through the process and the specifics in more depth shortly. Next, we have the fuel and electrical conduit. This can be used as an input for fuel and electricity. Fuel is not necessary once the thunderstorm has been formed, or even necessary to start it. It is a self-sustaining structure which harvests energy from wherever it needs to, whatever matter is available. However, fuel can be used to help kickstart the process or amplify it, or this could be used to atomically deconstruct unsafe waste products, such as nuclear waste or tip leachates. So we could potentially use this as a mechanism for turning things we don't want into effective fuel to help clean up waste streams that are currently difficult to break down or handle. And fuel can also be used to inject or kickstart or amplify our self-sustaining implosive thunderstorm as desired. Next, further to the right, we have the plasmoid emitter that I mentioned earlier. And there is a primary plasmoid emitter seen here in the center of the diagram, pointing into the center of the vortex waveguide. And there's also these smaller plasmoid emitters pointing in the opposite direction towards this copper disc. So this copper disc spins in the opposite direction to the small plasmoid emitters, which are fired into the disc in sequence. And again, we'll get back to how this part of the process works in a moment, once we've finished our brief full overview of the modules. We can see the final few modules shown to the right of the plasmoid emitter here: the charge distributor, quadrature collision alignment, and capacitor bank and ECU, electronic control unit, I guess. So this whole assembly is just here to provide high voltage bursts of power needed to sequentially discharge the plasmoid emitters. Pretty simple, really. The high voltage capacitors charge and discharge as required to control the sequential plasmoid emitter firing mechanism. The cone-shaped polycarbonate swirl guide to the far right fits right over the capacitor bank and the other electronics, and it also assists with guiding air into the swirl vane. And this completes our overview of the different modules that make up the Vajra implosive turbine direct matter to energy drive. Now let's go a little deeper into the phases of the system and see how these different modules function together. And this is where we'll also take a look at some diagrams and sections of the patent application itself. We'll begin where we ended last time, on the right side where the capacitor bank is contained in the conical waveguide. As I mentioned earlier, this is just the charging and control mechanism for the next part, the plasmoid firing assembly and the copper disc. The ECU and the capacitor bank provide high voltage, low average pulses of power to the plasmoid emitters. Let's zoom in and explore how this first process is working. So we see on the right side of the diagram, the plasmoid emitters mounted on a spinning assembly pointed to fire directly into a copper disc. So the plasmoid emitter assembly is being rotated clockwise. The copper disc is being rotated in the counterclockwise direction. So these two parts are spinning in opposite directions. This functions much like Nikola Tesla's rotary spark gap. The emitters are close to the copper disc, but they're not touching, and they fire in sequence. Instead of just being standard electrodes, though, sacred geometry is once again employed in the design of the plasmoid emitters. Not that it's not sometimes in standard electrodes too, in certain other ways. The emitters are surrounded by a gallium coolant and/or argon gas, and the guns themselves, the emitters, are constructed from tungsten, and they terminate in a sharp symmetrical point. And this is directly based on Stanley Mayer's plasmoid generating spark plug, another hidden technology. Stanley was poisoned, and his water-fueled car and his papers were suppressed when he tried to reveal his invention to the world. The tungsten emitter is designed to structure the high voltage charge from the capacitor and roll the plasma off the point in the form of a plasmoid, a toroidal or donut-shaped self-contained plasma structure, just like blowing a smoke ring. I like the plasmoids formed and utilized in the Thunderstorm generator, which are MSAR plasmoids born in water. The plasmoids fired here from the gun, the ones formed from Stanley Mayer's plasmoid spark plug are instead plasmoids born in air or other gases. So there is a difference between the two types of plasmoids, but we won't get more into this right now. Anyway, we can see on the left part of the diagram that the plasmoid gun rolls a toroidal plasmoid off its point, firing it at the copper disc, which is spinning in the opposite direction of the plasmoid emitter assembly. The plasmoids roll off the needle point like a smoke ring. Let's look at the patent application and reference the diagrams, and we'll then explain this process again in more simple language. So we see figure 9. Figure 9 shows an exemplary system for exciting a beam of charged particles, which are then transmitted through the turbine. The system comprises at least one capacitor bank, 70, which is chargeable by external devices. In typical implementations, 8 capacitor banks may be used, but this can of course be varied according to each use case. The capacitor bank 70 is connected to a first charge distributor, 80A, which is located adjacent to a second charge distributor, 80B. These charge distributors, 80A, 80B, are formed of a conductor surrounded by an insulating layer, for example, metal surrounded by a silicate carbide. The second charge distributor, 80B, is in connection with a charged particle source, 90, and a collector, 100. The charged particle source 90 arrangement comprises a series of charge generators, 92, provided on frame 94, extending from a central column, 96. The central column, 96, runs along the central axis and has an insulating outer layer from which the frame, 94, extends generally radially outwards. The frame, 94, typically comprises a series of extending arms, 942, which each carry at least one holder, 944, for holding a large charge generator, 92. Each charge generator, 92, as illustrated, comprises a sphere, 922, located on one end of a shank, 924, the other end of the shank, 924, having a pointed end, 926. The sphere, 922, is not essential, and in some embodiments, the generator, 92, may be formed in a different arrangement without the sphere, 922. This shank, 924, is approximately parallel to the central axis of C of the turbine, 10, and in the illustrated embodiment, the spheres, 922, are located at the end closest to the turbine, 10. The charge generators, 92, are typically in connection with the capacitor bank, 70, and or the charge distributors, 80A, 80B, which create a voltage in the charge generators, 92. When the voltage is sufficiently high, discharge, e.g. corona discharge or brush discharge, occurs from the pointed end 426. The opposite end being formed as a sphere, 922, can be beneficial as it can prevent discharge from occurring at that end, and so it occurs preferentially at the pointed end, 426. In some implementations, the charge generators, 92, may be Van der Graaf generators, and the spheres, 922, of the Van der Graaf generators comprise ion sources. In such a case, the field of the Van der Graaf generator, 92, accelerates the charged particles away from the sphere, 922. The pointed end, 926, of the shank, 924, acts as a point for discharge, which directs the charged particles along a line approximately perpendicular to the central axis, C, and in a direction away from the turbine, 10. The charged particles accelerated by the series of charge generators, 92, are directed towards an electrically conductive disk, 100, typically made of copper and located between the charged particle source, 90, and the charge distributors, 80A, 80B. This leads to an accumulation of charge on the disk 100, the disk therefore acting as a charge accumulator. The disk 100 is in connection with an electrically conducting central component within the central column, 96, which can conduct the charge. Typically, the movement of the charge is enhanced by placing the central column, 96, within an electric field. At the end of the central column, 96, furthest from the disk, 100, and the adjacent turbine, 10, is a pointed tip, 98. The concentration of charge on the tip, 98, can lead to ionization of the gas, creating charged particles, which are then repelled in a stream away from the tip, 98, passing into the turbine, 10. In order to maximize the charge accumulated on the disk 100, it can be beneficial to arrange the charge generators 92 in a manner which provides good spatial efficiency. In other words, that they are well spread out, but all have a direct, clear line to the disk 100. This is typically achieved by a spatial arrangement and/or typically there is relative rotation between the disk 100 and the holders 94, and so also the charge generators 92 held by the holders 94, to enhance the spread of the charge. Figures 10a and 10b illustrate a first exemplary arrangement for achieving this, and figures 11a and 11b illustrate a second exemplary arrangement. The relative rotation of the disk 100 and the holders 94 further means that soon after the stream of charged particles hits the disk 100, a different portion of the disk 100 then becomes aligned with the relevant holder 94. It is sufficient that there is relative motion between the disk 100 and the holders 94, i.e. only one of them may need to be rotating. However, it's typically preferable that the disk 100 rotates in a first direction and the holders 94 rotate in the opposite direction, as this can mean that each holder 94 is aligned with a greater spread of portions of the disk 100 over a particular time interval. Figures 10a and 10b illustrate an arrangement in which the central column 96 comprises 3 sections which each carry a set of 2 holders 94. As such, the holders 94 are distributed along the central column 96, as can be seen in the schematic illustration of figure 10a. The holders 94 are then preferably distributed around the axis B of the column 96, as can be seen in figure 10b. In this illustrated embodiment, each of the holders 94 carries 2 generators 92. Overall, the generators 92 are positioned on the holders 94 at different radial distances from the axis B. Figures 11a and 11b show an alternative arrangement of the charged particle source components 90. In this implementation, again, the central column 96 comprises 3 sections, which each carry a set of holders 94. However, in this configuration, the holders 94 have different configurations. Some holders comprise simply of an arm 942, which carries a single charge generator 92. One layer of charge generators 92, however, are held on a plate 946. Again, the generators 92 are distributed around the axis B at different angles at different radial distances, and this can provide good distribution across the surface area of the disk 100. Figure 10a, 10b, 11a, and 11b only show representative possible arrangements. Of course, different numbers of holders 94 and generators 92 may be used in different configurations. Whew. All right, so the plasmoids are fired into the copper disk and they tunnel in. Keep in mind that plasmoids are homeostatic, self-contained entities. They can affect matter, particularly conductive materials such as metal, but depending on their state of charge, they can also pass straight through them as if they were not there. In this case, the plasmoid is fired into the heart of the copper disk and it does create a small tunnel interacting with the metal. Instead of losing charge, as the plasmoid consumes the copper and deconstructs this matter back into DC energy to increase the mass of its own plasma body, it gains charge. It's able to drill the tunnel because it has a 0 point. A point of equilibrium between 2 opposing vortexes where matter, which is AC, alternating current, cannot exist. The copper should be 99.99% pure, by the way. If the copper moves through the 0 point of these highly charged plasmoids, it can no longer exist as matter. This is the process of taking energy in the 3rd dimension, matter, and changing it into energy in the 5th dimension, ether. The difference between matter and ether is time itself. According to Malcolm, the transition between ether to matter is the process of adding time to ether. The process between matter to ether is subtracting time from matter. This can be better understood through a study of Malcolm's plasmoid unification model, a circular slide rule which demonstrates the unification of these principles. We can understand the fundamental process of ether to matter conversion as it occurs in our solar system through the PUM. These concepts can then be applied on smaller scales. So if we just take a look at the 4 corners, we can see this process outlined. We have energy itself, or potential, 0 to 360 on the circle, 0 to 12 on the clock face, or 0 to 24. It's shown in conjunction with light, sixth dimension here, but let's ignore that part for now. So the Greek scholars called this corner energy, the ether, the holographic unified womb of all potential. The Vedic scholars called it the Akash, and it's now often referred to as the unified field. Here on the PUM, Malcolm notes that ether is direct current, DC, energy at rest, or permanence at rest. In this state or dimension, it has no form, and therefore, without form, there is no time. In the next corner, we have the sun, and this might seem abstractly placed, but it isn't. In our solar system, the sun is the beginning point. Not only modern scientists are aware of this, but so are all major civilizations throughout history. The sun is an ether, DC, to matter, AC converter. It's a geometric field structure, or a plasmoid, with a root radius of 432,000 miles and a root diameter of 864,000 miles. It takes DC energy, permanence at rest, to create permanence in motion, AC, or matter. Fractal harmonic perturbations in the field. This rate of motion determines how the matter manifests, and the shape of the time mold determines what manifestations it will take in this material world. The sun is a frequency imprinting device. This all comes back to sacred geometry and Vedic or vortex-based mathematics, somewhat synonymous, which are essential to making sense of any of this. If you're sitting here and you're thinking I'm just throwing a word salad, not actually saying anything comprehensible, I highly recommend taking Randall Carlson's Sacred Geometry course over on HowTube. Randall teaches all of the basics, and this course is a perfect unintentional companion to Malcolm's more esoteric notes, where he employs many of these foundational geometric principles without giving much context. If you still think sacred geometry is quackery and has no relevance to science after doing Randall's course, then you should probably go back to blindly tinkering and leave science to greater minds. I know no one likes hearing that from a 33-year-old vegetable farmer, but I don't really care. Go and hear it from the physicists at CERN, or back in time to hear it from Pythagoras if you need to. It's the truth. Sacred geometry is the fundamental consideration behind all other considerations of space, time, language, and frequency. Geometry is the cause over time, and therefore of frequency, which is work over time, cycles per unit of time. The numbers we see here on the plasmoid unification model are not arbitrary either, and they're not used arbitrarily in the examples that Malcolm provides. Numbers, in the full scope of how they were originally supposed to be used, compose an intelligent analog language which can be used to map sacred geometry and all considerations in our universe. We'll not get too deep into this at the moment. You can see my video, The Laws of Sanskrit Mathematics, or The Laws of Vedic Mathematics, we perhaps should have called it, which I collaborated with Malcolm to produce as a kind of legend or key to reading his notes and understanding how he uses numbers a little bit differently, not as linear sequences, but with multi-dimensional consideration. But going back to the PUM, we have ether, energy, DC current, unformed potential. Sun, the great ether, DC to matter, AC converter at our solar system. Also representing the deeper principle of sacred geometry to some extent here, the universal form of God modeled in his own image. The picture here may be too great in scale for us to see from our viewpoint, but we can see the same geometry of the fractal toroidal moment, the cause of all material causes in the human face, the human body, the leaf, the tree, all forms of life, and all things are essentially forms of life in some fashion, ranging from elemental intelligence to willful genius. And we can thank Bob Greene here for his finding this sacred geometric principle demonstrated in many other circumstances too, including the examples above using his model, and also on the inside of water bubble cavitation reactors. And I have several videos covering these findings, particularly in regards to the Thunderstorm generator. So the sun generates protium, more commonly known as hydrogen, which is actually a group rather than an element itself, as Malcolm teaches. Protium is the first element, which has one proton and one electron. It has a melting point of negative 259.2 degrees Celsius, and this number, 259.2, is inherently connected to 25,920 years being the great year, one full precession of the equinox. So the period it takes for all planets and stars to realign again in their process of their great individual cycles. They get back to the same place. The melting point of protium, and perhaps in more esoteric and controversial terms, the frequency of its spin, is in perfect octave resonant harmony with the frequency or the cycles per unit of time of our solar system itself. Our solar system, in terms of matter, is primarily composed of protium, and therefore it is protium which defines the great year frequency of the solar system itself. We exist as part of a greater resonant harmonic instrument or system. 2592 is connected to 864 in a multitude of ways that we don't really have time to go through in this video explicitly, but understanding how these harmonic numbers work together, it is essential to understanding the deeper and self-evidential aspects of Malcolm's model of physics. It's practically impossible to apply any of these ideas if we attempt to understand a number as a linear progression only. Once again, see my Laws of Sanskrit Mathematics video. It's a low-budget production, but the basics are there. It's a good video. In the next quarter, we have time. Time is the mold in which matter is formed. Perhaps Malcolm's most famous quote. It's the fourth dimension, the difference between the fifth and the third dimensions, literally and figuratively. This is represented a little confusingly here on the PUM, but for the sake of explaining things briefly and simply here, just take it as it is. Aether, fifth dimension, time, fourth dimension, matter, third dimension. Time itself is composed of equal and opposite forces. We see time represented numerically as the number 518,400 here. And this is probably getting a little too deep into the numbers for the moment, a rabbit hole I am reluctant to go down when this video is already going to be quite detailed and lengthy, but it helps perhaps to paint the picture for later when more people begin to understand the numbers themselves are an objective language. They are real and alive, and it's essential to understand how numbers can be used multidimensionally rather than linearly if we're to apply these analog concepts to engineering and other practical sciences. So you can't work this out with the normal linear mathematics that most people learn. It'd be pretty hard. It'd be an overlay, a secondary system. I am going on about it a little bit, but it really must be understood, or the technology can't be understood. Time is represented numerically as 518,400, and there are 51,840 seconds in the 6 days of creation in the Bible. The moon travels 518,400 miles in its rotation on the Earth each day, and the angle of the slope of the Great Pyramid of Giza is 51.84 degrees. And this is also the angle of the slope of the Cheops Pyramid and many other pyramids around the world, precisely. 5184 is, of course, double or an octave of the great year frequency, or the melting point or phase change point of protium, 2592. And I'm ignoring the zeros and the decimal points here. These only represent amplitude and a shift in the musical scale. So this is another rule of what we give credit to as Vedic or Sanskrit mathematics, which is somewhat synonymous with Marco Rodin's vortex-based mathematics, which he respectively decrypted from the Baha'i scriptures. Malcolm Bendel, Marco Rodin, Randall Carlson, Ed Nightingale, all these guys are all rediscovering the same objective system of mathematics employed by the ancient advanced cultures who used numbers as a language before us. Numbers were used in this way all over the world, and we've forgotten a lot of how we use numbers. We're using a very small aspect of mathematics these days, and we can prove this. This is evidential. I may not be able to give you the full details, but we can tell. We can tell. I've got enough evidence at this point. Anyway, another important consideration is the construction of 518,400, time itself. 518,400 is the product of 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Or alternatively of 8 times 9 times 10 times 10 times 9 times 8. Equal and opposite mirror numbers. And there's so much more to this. It is a key point, but it does require its own video, and I already have a little bit about this. Essentially, though, to get back to the more descriptive language, time is a vessel in which matter is formed. It's dependent on the principle of geometry, sacred geometry specifically. Time is the mold in which matter is formed. Here's a quote from Malcolm's notes. As all matter is constructed in the mold of time, to understand matter, one must first understand time. as all calculations of energy is in terms of work over time. If one could reverse or accelerate time, instead of being required to do more work, one could simply reduce the time factor for an increase in energy. Time itself is constructed by equal and opposite mirror numbers. As for every force, there is an equal and opposite force. As above, so below. End of quote. Within the mold of time, we get matter. Matter is alternating current, energy, or permanence in motion. And this is where we get the saying, it's all just frequency, because it is all just frequency. All matter is formed in a resonant geometric cavitation, a magnetodielectric field perturbation, or the ether, the Akash, the unified field. And from this phenomena, we see, hear, smell, touch, and taste all of the variegated different manifestations that arise. Different frequencies along with their unique harmonic overtones, according to the senses our body is equipped with. Our senses act like bandpass filters, if you know anything about music or audio engineering. They determine the boundaries of the spectrum of frequency which can be received through that orifice. The mind is a sense too, and together these physical senses allow us to perceive the world from a certain limited frame of reference. So we're really going down a rabbit hole now, but it's incredibly tempting to dive deeper into the plasmoid unification model, a little bit of philosophy, but I must restrain myself for now. We'll continue on with our explanation of the Vajra direct matter to energy drive. So here's where we left off. The plasmoid is fired into the counter-spinning copper disk, tunnels in, consumes the copper, it gains charge, increasing its own potential energy and growing larger, and eventually it hits a critical point, and this is all happening within an instant. The plasmoid reaches the limit of its tunnel, and it gets ready to rebound. So keep in mind that it has gained mass, or in other words, charge density. So it's actually going to fire back out of the copper disk with even more velocity than it was fired in, rather than the other way around. So the plasmoid essentially creates its own bullet, its own gun barrel, and its own gunpowder, and then it fires itself back out with incredible force. So remember that the disk is spinning in the opposite direction to the plasmoid firing assembly. So in this second diagram, we can see the plasmoid gun has moved out of the way now. And instead, we can see our plasmoid rebounding right back out of its tunnel into the copper disk. As represented in the diagram, we can see that it continues to gain charge on the rebound. The plasmoid pulls matter in through its clockwise imploding vortex, and this matter is deconstructed into direct current energy as it passes through the 0 point, or the plane of inertia. It's literally a miniature plasma thunderstorm. As we discussed earlier with the atomic bomb example, implosion is not like explosion. This toroidal sacred geometry is called sacred for a reason. The fractal toroidal moment can generate and sustain extreme levels of implosive force, heat, and pressure that's thousands of orders of magnitude higher than what we're able to generate with our current explosive technologies. So we find the following quote in the article authored by prominent experimental physicist and plasmoid or ball lightning expert Ken Shoulders, large-scale propulsion using EVOs. And EVOs means exotic vacuum objects, and it's essentially synonymous with plasmoids. These were all different names that were applied in similar ways. They might have slight differences, but we're talking about plasmoids or ball lightning phenomena here. All right, here's the quote. Under good dielectric operating conditions, the compression strength limit of the dielectric material, usually in the range of 200,000 pounds per square inch, becomes the apparent load carrying limit between the EVO ensemble and the vehicle. If this is the case, then a propulsion unit with the area of 1 square inch would transmit 200,000 pounds of force in any direction commanded to a vehicle. This force would be generated and maintained under static conditions using EVO control parameters without any input power. Changing the thrust vector would require whatever reactive power was dissipated across the dielectric in order to convey the control fields. This is certainly a trivial power input. The force attributed to a single EVO exerted against a target far exceeds the strength of the best known materials. This is seen both as the ability to easily bore holes through the material and to hurl it against a similar material, puncturing holes in it and embedding the primary material. Under these conditions, it is assumed that the force available for propulsion is still limited to the above cited 200,000 pounds per square inch. End quote.
Just wanted to finish off on the main question, which was about thrust.
Yeah.
This is what I wanted to go back to propulsion and your laser thing, which was actually an ejector from a self-styled barrel that a plasmoid, or actually it's EVO is probably in fact Shamir is the term I like best. But anyway, you fire something in, and it reacts and it fires itself out. I want to make about that just to give you metrics so you can understand. So I was in a meeting with the guy that held the patent for the F-35 fighter on behalf of Lockheed Martin. And basically I said to him what I'm saying to you now. I said, if you look at Ken Shoulder's work, 1 square inch, according to his calculations, would be 200,000 pounds of thrust, right? 200 pounds per square inch. If you take the equivalent for the F-35 fighter, you've got about 40,000 pounds of thrust to over 1,000 square inch. That's 5,000 times difference.
Yeah.
Right? Just think about that for a second, and then let's think about flying sources, right?
Yep.
Thrust and dynamics. I think you know where this is going.
So Ken Shoulder's quotes here, 200,000 pounds of force per square inch could be produced. Based on the specifications, Malcolm states for the Vajra implosive turbine, the fact that it has a total area of 1,080 square inches, we can calculate that it should be able to produce somewhere around 216 million pounds of force available for propulsion. And this is an astronomically large number. To put it into context, Malcolm says that based on these calculations, we should be able to travel to Mars in around 2 to 3 months. So most of this time would be spent speeding up and slowing down. The main part of the travel would actually only take around 2 weeks. Perhaps this is jumping too far ahead, though. So Winston Bostick's observations, another plasmoid researcher around these same topics, they're also in line with what Ken Shoulders says. He mentions enormous, unheard of levels of force available for effective propulsion can be produced utilizing plasmoids. But we are jumping ahead. There is a lot to break down here. Let's go back and finish describing the full process of what's going on. I've linked to that article with the quote from Ken Shoulders down in the description. Also an article from Winston Bostick, if you want to take a look. And another reference that Malcolm recommends in this regard is the 1939 paper by Oppenheimer and Schneider on continued gravitational contraction, which gives the formulas to calculate the force generated from an imploding sphere, a principle which is integral to the functioning of both the Vajra implosive turbine and the Thunderstorm generator, plasmoids in general. So I've included the link to this paper here too. So the plasmoids are being fired into the copper disk. They consume the copper, deconstructing the copper as it passes through their 0 point plane. They gain charge, fire back out, gaining even more charge as they go, creating effective thrust. These rebounding plasmoids are harvested by the Thunderstorm, being formed in the implosive waveguide below, and they're utilized as a primary structured plasma fuel source and a catalyst as well. As in the Thunderstorm generator, here the plasmoids also emulate the actions of the larger Thunderstorm just on a smaller scale, helping to tear apart or atomically deconstruct matter as it's swept into the greater imploding vortex. But let's go back to the copper disk for a moment. What happens to those little tunnels formed by the plasmoids and left in the copper after they rebound out? Here's the process according to Malcolm, claims which are strongly supported by evidence from Ken Shoulders' experiments where he employed these same processes, and also the recent observations made by Bob Grenier during his scanning electron microscope and EDS analysis of various water bubble cavitation devices, where he confirmed that ball lightning can cause the fusion or synthesis of new elements, including but absolutely not limited to gold. Atomic reconstruction or transmutation of the elements, just as the old alchemists claimed. Anyway, we see in the diagram here, the plasmoid has fired out, and the void it created in the copper is left completely devoid of matter. It is for an instant devoid of time altogether. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous and contradictory statement, devoid of time for an instant, but I mean those words. We misunderstand time when we only consider things in terms of relativity. Time is a harmonic fractal occurrence. All scales of the fractal spin in a harmonic symphony. This is the music of the spheres. The speed of light is not a constant. Light does travel at 144,000 miles per hour around the surface of the Earth, 7.5 times in 1 second. It does have an identifiable average rate of induction within context, but the speed of light is not constant. It's a variable. The speed of light equals the rate of induction of light through the ether. We can dilate time, reverse or accelerate it in another part of the fractal without noticeably influencing or altering time as it occurs from our own frame of reference. So can these voids created by the firing plasmoids be devoid of time for what seems like an instant from our own frame of reference? Absolutely. Time is variable, influenceable, occurring at different rates on different levels of the fractal. So when we strip all matter from what we conceive of as space, there is no matter, there is no time. This particular coordinate of our great harmonic space-time structure of a universe becomes temporarily devoid of motion. Devoid of motion, but there is no such thing as empty space. There is something there. We're back to ether, DC energy, prima materia. The ether begins to acquire frequency. Ether condenses into matter, and at this point, most people will consider this in terms of protons, electrons, and neutrons, particles, which serve to illustrate the forming of elemental particle designations. The particles reform as a liquid molten alloy. In the case of the Van der implosive turbine, gold can be produced along with some more copper, but by adjusting the various parameters of the apparatus, any element could technically be produced. There's a direct proportional relationship between mass and time. If something speeds up or positively charges, it loses mass. If something slows down or negatively charges, it gains mass. The atomic mass will determine the element we will get, or the isotope. All interrelated concepts, but I'm not much of a chemist. I don't usually talk in the terms of particles. Next, the liquid molten alloy will cool to become a solid, while the disk continues to spin in the opposite direction to the spinning plasmoid emitters. So let's take a look at some of the work of the late Kenneth Radford Shoulders, who we mentioned earlier, to gain some further perspective. I have a quick clip of Malcolm and Bob talking about the process we've discussed here and the importance of Ken's work, so I'll quickly play this first for introduction.
This goes back to the understanding of the vortices and how if you fire a plasmoid into a copper plate, which you can go to Ken Shoulders' work and see that, then it's really interesting because it's like a self-building gun. So you can imagine you fire the plasmoid in, now it's made its barrel. It then transmutes the elements and the frequency at which, and the frequency being the amount of energy with it. If you pick the right energy, you can produce reliably the copper, 99.99% copper, into 75% gold and 25% copper alloy. Now, in that process, and that process is in my notes there, and I explain it in my HowTube, Malcolm. You can go and see my lecture series, which is like 15 lectures. But the idea is you have, so this self-making gun, it makes its own barrel, it goes down, effectively makes its own gunpowder, and with the transmutation of the elements, effectively makes its own bullets. And then it fires that outside the same hole, right? That's a thrust, right? So I pointed out, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and the biggest giant there at the moment, I think, in this context, besides acknowledging Bob's giant effort in the last 12 years to get all this together. But I think probably Bob would agree with me that Kenneth Radford Shoulders was really the hero of this. Do you agree, Bob?
I
Can you
would
say something on that?
What Ken did most importantly is he translated the observations of John Hutchison into and the original plasmoid work of Bostic and Nardi, and the original sort of Lafferty book on arc vacuum discharges. He synthesized that with his own unique and capability to do plasma and vacuum experiments and to record what was going on into an understanding of the basic science. He quantified the 100,000 electrons to an ion capability carrying of these systems. But I think the most important thing that he did in all of this story is when he understood the significance of this and the fact that it was an oscillating monopole, a perfect oscillating monopole, and so forth, he found a way to apply for patents and ensure that they weren't locked up in secrecy orders. And by doing that, he showed exactly what you needed to do, but he also had the book out there. And then because they didn't lock up the patents, he was then able to explore it further and publish these beautiful little PDFs that he did in his own way at his own website until it was taken down 2 days after I made it public.
All right, so we can see an historical example of this process of synthesizing gold and other elements by firing plasmoids into a copper disc in the presentation from Ken Shoulders showed during his talk at the MIT Cold Fusion Conference in 2005. So you can check out this slideshow for yourself if you're interested. We're only going to go through a couple slides in this video. I've added a link in the description to that. But if we skip forward to take a look at the 8th slide for now, we can see an example provided by Ken in his presentation of the results of the same process that Malcolm's employing in the Vajra implosive turbine. This image is of a copper electrode viewed under the scanning electron microscope. So this image was taken after a plasmoid was fired into the electrode, and we'll see the result of this here. A tunnel into the copper and a flower-like structure flowing out of the target center. Bob Grenier has observed and shared his findings of many similar structures found inside other fusion reactors, some of which we've covered previously in my videos as well. So if we go to the next slide, we see another zoomed-in plasmoid impact example in this photograph now. And in this sample, we can read below the image, copper target after experiment, with traces of solidified silver and white lava on its petals, which had flowed out of the target center. And we can see a deeper analysis of one of these structures on the next slide. So the method of investigation here was X-ray electron probe microanalysis, element detection range from Na to U, and the material of the target was 99.9% pure copper to begin with. In the analysis of the sample, we see that all sorts of elements have been synthesized here. Amongst the points sampled, just pointing out some of the gold ones, we find gold at 22.1%, along with copper 67.2%. We also see gold 52.7%, along with copper 45.3% here. And we see all sorts of other elements being formed too. Gold is the final evolution of metals, in a sense. Once again, as all the old alchemists said, but the process can be done partially as well. So other elements can be synthesized. In the next slide, we see the analysis of the accumulating screen used in the same experiment, number 2107, also originally 99.9% pure copper used here. But here too, of course, we can see that after the experiment, many different elements can be observed at different points of the sample. Right here we can see 74.7% gold with 25.3% copper, found at one point on the screen. And this is getting mighty close to Malcolm's calculation for the reconstruction composition of the impact areas of the Vajra implosive turbine copper disk. And this is a much more complex device he's producing here, which should produce better results. All right, we need to keep moving on from the copper disk and the plasmoid firing assembly modules and get on to talk about other parts of the drive, but this is important to talk about. The drive can not only be purposed for propulsion, it can also be employed simply just for transmutation or atomic reconstruction, or power generation, or creating an ionized plasmoid beam. The direct energy to matter drive is used in this way for the design of the Bendel Tesla well power plant, for instance, making an ionized beam. So this is multi-use. It's like an engine. The Vajra is the universal engine, or the beating heart of the Thunderstorm. It's not just a turbine. Malcolm also mentioned that a second copper disk can actually be added to the design to essentially harness the rebounding plasmoids, which are increasing in charge density as they rebound, for perpetual motion, a net increase in mass as copper is replaced by gold as well. So it's not breaking the laws of conservation of energy. The energy is there to harness already. As I've said, there are no isolated systems in physics. It's just a way of structuring energy as desired by forming geometric, self-contained homeostatic thunderstorms that do all the work and regulate time itself. This is a living process. The universe is living. This is described in regards to the exemplary system shown in figure 12 of the patent application. So I'll read a little more for the patent here. You can skip over this if you don't wish for all the technical details. Figure 12 shows a further exemplary system, which in addition to and adjacent to the electrically conductive disk 100, comprises a further electrically conductive disk 102. This further disk 102 provides further capacity for charge accumulation. Typically, the disk 100 and the further disk 102 are electrically connected, but in some implementations, they may be electrically insulated from one another, such that sparks occur, e.g. via arc or spark discharge, between the disk 100 and the further disk at sufficient charge levels. In some implementations, a shield, non-illustrated, is further provided so that the sparks can be stopped when desired. By way of example, the shield may be formed of an electrically insulating material, i.e. having high dielectric strength, and be insertable between the disk 100 and further disk 102, and reversibly removable. As a further example, the shield may comprise intermittent apertures, which can be rotated such that a particular region can be shielded or exposed as desired. Anyway, let's move on to the next phase of the complete process of the Vajra implosive turbine. If we return to this diagram, we can see the plasmoid emitters wired to the charge distributor and capacitor bank. These emitters fire off plasmoids, and as we discussed, into the counter-rotating copper disc we see to the right of the plasmoid emitters. And we've discussed this in detail now. The plasmoids thrusting themselves out of the copper disc travel directly towards the implosive waveguide, and they're drawn into the implosive vortex, being sustained at the center of the implosive vortex waveguide during the next part of the process. The larger primary plasmoid emitter we see here points directly into the vortex. Large plasmoids are fired off directly here to further provide more fuel and an inherent catalyst in itself for the vortex. It's like feeding a large vortex with smaller vortexes. They all do the work in a fractal sense, both the big counter-opposing vortex structure and the small counter-opposing vortex structures, the plasmoids. They all contain their own 0 points. They all tear apart matter, remove the time factor, and convert AC matter to DC energy as it passes through this plane. The implosive vortex waveguide itself is the Vajra. It can be expanded or contracted, as can the waveguide aperture control, the iris module we mentioned earlier, which can be seen to the left of the Vajra. In this way, with a simple horizontal pulsing movement, the implosive vortex waveguide and 0-point aperture control can be expanded and contracted like a beating heart. And this can be used to create pulses of thrust, just like a ramjet, as demonstrated in the Strike Foundation video that we showed earlier. And it can also be used essentially as a static volume control for the vortex for certain use cases as a turbine. The implosive vortex waveguide and the aperture control can be adjusted together to control the output of the device and the nature of the vortex being produced. So while we're on the topic of the Vajra being like a beating heart, it's probably appropriate to play another quick clip from Malcolm on this topic. There was one recently. Knowing the heart to know the Vajra is, of course, allegorical and literal once again.
Question, this is specifically for you, Malcolm, by Cosmic. It says, Malcolm once said that the heart creates plasmoids. Can you please expand on that?
Yeah, one of my first revelations, and this is about, will explain people's intuition and the fact that, you know, often you talk about two brains, the heart being one brain and the head being the other brain. Yeah. So basically, the heart, the geometry of the heart was an inspiration for the development of the Vajra, because that's a left and right hand spin, male and female clockwise and anti-clockwise. So the heart's design is specifically two spiral muscles, one imploding and one exploding. That is that there's a sheath in between them. So in fact, your heart is dueling tornadoes, one to do compression and one to do expansion. So basically what you have is When the blood is pulled in, you create a vacuum, and that vacuum expands the gases in the blood. And then when the heart contracts, that collapses those bubbles, and you have multi-axis shear, and you're going through the valve there. So basically, when that is pressured and it collapses, it does produce plasmoids. Your blood corpuscles are actually plasmoids. If it's like God's put his fingerprints on it, and you had a sphere and he pushed them together and squeezed them, and that's exactly the shape of a blood corpuscle. It's a torus. It's an imploded torus. Why is it a torus? Well, because it's the home to, in my economy, every blood corpuscle will have a central 0 point that is a plasmoid, that is generated by the heart. And so I think the amount of plasmoids in the blood, that's why I was so gung-ho about going into a Guy Belinsky's machine every 3 days and infusing myself with plasmoids, bringing my blood up to 250,000 volts every 3 days so that I could get a population of plasmoids inside myself, which is just accelerate the normal process so that then, you could get enough, a bigger area to hear the universe. That's how I view it.
Fantastic, thanks.
Back to the implosive turbine. Let's go through the description and the diagrams of the Vajra implosive vortex waveguide in the patent document first, and then we'll break things down a little more simply again. And this is a little lengthy. You can skip over it if you want. It gives you a little bit of detail, but it is worth going through. Chuck it on 2 times speed. I'll read really fast, so maybe you won't be able to understand me. Let's see how we go. Figure 1 shows a cross-section of an assembled turbine 10. The turbine 10 is formed as a turbine comprising a series of interconnecting plates, 12, 14, each of which is positioned tangential to a central axis C in figure 1. The turbine shape comprises 2 types of plates, an outer plate 12 and an inner plate 14. The plates form the blades of the turbine, and so will be referred to interchangeably as blades or plates. In the preferable illustrated embodiment, there are a total of 30 blades forming the central body of the turbine shape, 15 of the outer plates 12, and 15 of the inner plates 14. Figure 2a shows a plan view of the outer plate 12, and figure 2b shows a plan view of the inner plate 14. The outer plates 12, as illustrated in figure 2a, are formed as a crescent-shaped flat plate, typically having a thickness of a few millimeters, for example, 0.3 to 3 millimeters. The outer convex curved edge of the crescent shape has a larger radius of curvature than the inner concave curved edge. Along the inner concave curved edge, there is a series of slots, 120, at the central portion, where the width of the overall crescent shape is greatest. The slots, 120, extend to approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the overall width of the plate 12. While at the ends, where the width is smallest, the slots extend to approximately half of the width. In the illustrated embodiment, there are 15 of each type of plate, and correspondingly, there are 15 slots, 120, in each plate 12. This is because each of the slots, 120, is configured to receive an inner plate 14. At each of the 2 ends of the crescent shape of the outer plates 12, there is a tab 122, which extends approximately radially outwards from the main body of the plate 12. Adjacent each tab 122 and separated by the outermost slots 126, so between the outermost slots 126 and the adjacent slots at each end, is a further projection 124 extending inwardly from the inner concave curved surface. The tabs 122 and projections 124 are configured to secure the engagement of the outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14 to form the interconnected shape of the turbine 10. Additionally, there is a further formation, 128, near the outer edge of the plate 12, typically near the center of the main body of the plate 12. This further formation, 128, is configured to facilitate attachment of the plate 12 to a spoke not shown, which in turn is connected to an outer ring, again not shown. Akin to a bicycle wheel, the spoke and outer ring can turn relative to the central axis C, The attachment of the spoke to the plate 12 means that the turbine 10 can similarly be turned relative to the central axis C. In the illustrated embodiment, the formation 1 to 8 is formed as an aperture having a circular section and a horizontal rectangular section joined by a horizontal rectangular section. However, the formation 128 may take other forms, which can also facilitate a secure connection between the plate 12 and at least one spoke. The inner plates 14, as illustrated in figure 2b, are also formed as a crescent-shaped flat plate, typically having a thickness of a few millimeters, for example 0.3 to 3 millimeters. The inner concave curved edge has a larger radius of curvature than the outer convex edge. Preferably, the inner curved edge has the same radius of curvature as the outer curved edge of the outer plates 12. This means that when the turbine 10 is assembled, the outer edge of the outer plates 12 has the same radius of curvature as the inner edge of the inner plates 14. Along the outer convex curved edge of the crescent shape are a series of slots 140. Again, at the central portion, there where the width of the overall crescent shape is greatest, the slots 140 extend approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the overall width of the plate 14, while at the ends, where the width is smallest, the slots extend to approximately half of the width. Similarly, as the illustrated embodiment of the turbine 10 comprises 15 inner plates 12 and 15 outer plates 14, there are 15 slots 140 on each of the inner plates 14. Each of the slots 140 are configured to receive one of the outer plates 12. At the ends of the crescent shape of each inner plate 14, there is a finger 146 projecting inwardly at approximately a right angle to the surface of the inner concave edge at that location. These fingers 146 are configured to be connectable to a power, energy, and/or charge source such as a capacitor. Alternatively, the connections by the fingers 146 facilitate discharge from the plates. For example, charge may accumulate in the case that the plate is moving through an electric field and/or as the result of radiation passing through the turbine. One or more of the fingers 146 may be connected at the same time, and this connection may be by connected wires or preferably a commutator and/or brush arrangement at each end, which avoids difficulties of wires becoming tangled when the turbine 10 is spinning. Between the outermost slots 142 and the adjacent slots are outwardly extending projections 144. Optionally, the inner plates 14 are also comprised a formation 148 configured to connect to a spoke, in a similar manner to that as described in respect to the outer plate 12. The inner plates 14 and outer plates 12 are joined together by fitting the slots 122 and 142 together, i.e. within one another. Each of the set of slots 122 on each outer plate 12 is connected to a slot 142 on a different inner plate 12, and each of the set of slots 142 on each inner plate 14 is connected to a slot 122 on a different outer plate 12. In particular, the outermost slots 126 of the outer plates 12 engage with the outermost slots 142 of the inner plates 14. As these outermost slots 126, 142 on the two types of plates extend across approximately half the width of each plate in that region, this leads to a deep engagement of the slots and consequently the plates at the ends, helping to secure the connection. The security of the connection is enhanced by the projections 124 of the outer plates 12 and the projections 144 of the inner plates 14, both extending in a direction towards the connection point. This arrangement causes the outer plate 12 to be positioned tangentially to the central axis C in a first orientation, and the inner plates to be positioned tangentially to the central axis C in a second orientation, and together they form an arrangement akin to a basket weave to form the turbine 10. The outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14 can be seen to twist within the turbine in opposite directions. For example, twist in a clockwise direction can be referred to as female, and twist in an anti-clockwise direction as male. The turbine 10 is configured to be rotatable, the rotation being driven via spokes connecting the blades to a rotating outer ring. In some implementations, however, the turbine 10 can be used stationary. At the first end of the turbine 10, the tabs 122 of the outer plates are connected via support pins 22 to a plate 24 of an entrance aperture 20. The pins 22 hold the turbine 10 in position relative to the entrance aperture 20, through which a relevant stream or radiation beam passes into the turbine 10. There is typically further provided at this location a focuser 40, which is shaped as a funnel with the narrow end entering the turbine 10. At the opposite end of the turbine 10, the tabs 122 of the outer plates 12 are connected by support pins 36 to aperture plates 32 within an exit component 30. A plan view of the shape of the aperture plates 32 is shown in figure 2C. The aperture plates 32 are a flat plate having a teardrop shaped with a generally circular main body. Preferably the radius of curvature of the circle portion of the body of the aperture plates 32 is equal to the radius of the curvature of the outer curved edge of the outer plates 12 and the inner curved edge of the inner plates 14. Each of the aperture plates 32 is positioned such that its flat surface is perpendicular to central axis C of the turbine 10. As the main body of the aperture plates 32 is positioned radially outwards from the central axis C, it can be advantageous that the radius of curvature of the main body is equal to the curvature of the outer edge of the outer plates 12 and the inner edge of the inner plates 14. Figure 3 illustrates an end view of the aperture 30 looking down along the central axis C of the turbine 10. Each of the plates 32 is surrounded by and supported by an iris 34 within an outer support ring 38. Each of the aperture plates 32 forms a segment of the exit aperture, defining the diameter A of the aperture. The basket weave arrangement of the turbine 10 means the turbine is collapsible and expandable. This movement changes the positioning of the tabs 122 of the outer plates 12, which changes the relative positioning of the aperture plates 32 via the support pins 36. In this manner, the diameter A of the exit aperture can be adjusted. The turbine 10 can be collapsed to a fully flat arrangement, i.e. the outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14 are all within the same plane. The basket weave arrangement of the turbine 10 is further configurable such that it can be flipped, i.e. it can be collapsed and then expanded in the opposite direction. This has the effect that the set of outer plates 12 change the orientation with which they twist. Similarly, the inner plates 14 also change the orientation with which they twist. Figure 4 shows a first arrangement of the turbine 10 in a relatively compressed or collapsed state in which the inner plates 14 and outer plates 12 are at a relatively large tangential angle to the central axis C. This configuration can be achieved by moving the exit component 30 closer to the entrance aperture 20 or vice versa. In this configuration, the diameter of the exit aperture is relatively large, as is illustrated by the aperture diameter labeled A in figure 4. In the extreme, the turbine 10 can be collapsed to a fully compressed state in which the inner plates 14 and outer plate 12 are at least very close to perpendicular to the central axis C, other connections permitting, and the entrance aperture 20 and exit component 30 are brought close to one another. Figure 5a shows a second arrangement of the turbine 10 in a relatively expanded state, in which the tangential angle between the inner plates 14 and outer plates 12 to the central axis C is relatively small. This configuration can be achieved by moving the exit component 30 further away from the entrance aperture 20 or vice versa. In this arrangement, the tabs 122 of the outer plates 12 are in relatively close proximity to one another, leading to the exit aperture having a relatively small diameter, as indicated by A in figure 5a. In the extreme, the turbine 10 can be closed by extending it to such an extent that the aperture plates 32 of the exit aperture 30 come together, closing the aperture, i.e. the diameter A of the aperture becomes 0. This is shown in figure 5b, which illustrates an end view of the turbine, showing the aperture in a closed configuration. Such an arrangement can be used in, for example, a ramjet. The outer plates 12 and inner plates 10 are typically made of an electrically conducting material such as metal, for example, copper or tungsten. The plates are preferably annealed to improve the electrical conductivity. This can be achieved by a heating anneal process, followed by a quenching in argon. The outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14 are electrically insulated from one another. There are typically provided electrically insulating dielectric components, e.g. inserts at the point of the connection between the outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14, for example, made out of ceramic material, which can act to insulate the outer plates 12 from the inner plates 14. In some implementations, however, some of the blades are made of a dielectric material, for example, a ceramic or a polycarbonate. By way of example, adjacent blades may alternate between metal and dielectric. Outer blades 12 may be metal and inner blades 14 dielectric, or vice versa, etc. The pins 22, 36 connecting and supporting the blades are comprised of or coated in an electrically insulating material. The aperture plates 32 and or the focus of 40 are typically made of a dielectric material such as polycarbonate. This can aid in focusing the stream of material such as a fuel mixture while not hindering passage of radiation waves. An arrangement in which the turbine 10 can be flipped can be advantageous for enabling the properties of the turbine to be altered. Flipping the blade arrangement of the turbine 10 changes the twist of the outer blades 12 and the inner blades 14. This can be used to alter the performance of the turbine 10. For example, altering the direction of the blades can cause a vortex of air or other gas created by the movement of the blades to be formed in the other orientation, i.e. the opposite direction of rotation. In implementations in which the blades comprise of a combination of electrically conducting and electrically insulating materials, flipping the orientation of the blades can alter the electrical properties of the turbine 10. For example, the outer blades 12 may be electrically conducting and the inner blades 14 electrically insulating. And flipping the turbine 10 means the outer blades 12 are arranged in the opposite orientation, i.e. opposing direction of twist. In order to facilitate the turbine 10 being able to be flipped to the opposite orientation, the connections via the support pins 22 to a plate 24 of an entrance aperture 20 and the connections via support pins 36 to the exit component 30 can be configured to be disconnectable and reconnectable, i.e. reversibly connectable. Furthermore, the spokes may be connected to and movable over an arc-shaped outer shape, for example a sphere, to facilitate the full range of movement of the plates. In use, the turbine 10 may be stationary or it may be rotated. The particular implementation is typically dependent on the environment in which turbine 10 is being used. For example, if being used in water or on land, then the turbine 10 is typically used spinning or rotating. If the turbine 10 is used in a low-pressure atmosphere, for example in space, then the turbine 10 is typically used stationary, static. At atmospheric pressure, the turbine 10 may be used in a spinning or stationary manner. The outer plates 12 and the inner plates 14 are both positioned tangentially to the central axis C, but at different orientations. If the turbine 10 is rotated, the outer blades 12 and the inner blades 14 cause any gas, such as air, to be moved at a tangential direction, forming a vortex. Different arrangements of the turbine 10, e.g. to the extent which the blades 12 and 14 are extended or compressed, lead to a different airflows through the turbine 10, as well as different diameters A of the exit aperture. The arrangement and movement of the turbine 10 and of the surrounding components can determine whether air is moved outwards or inwards when rotated. Typically, the ratio of volume between the outer edges of the outer plates 12 and between the inner edges of the inner plates 14 is 5:1. This can mean, depending on the arrangement, that the gas can be compressed or expanded by movement inwards or outwards caused by rotation of the plates. If the air is moved outwards, the vortex flow creates a vacuum within the central axis C of the turbine 10, the size of which can be controlled by the extension or compression of the turbine 10. This vacuum can be utilized to draw in and compress fuel and air mixtures. The extent of expansion or compression of the turbine, 10, can control the extent of compression of a fuel mixture and the width of the exiting stream. In other implementations, the turbine 10 can be used to compress air, which can give rise to a vortex within the center around the central axis C. Alternatively, the turbine 10 can be used simply as effective cooling through moving gas such as air. Furthermore, when the turbine 10 is rotated, the electrically conducting plates form an effective waveguide for radiation waves passing through. As the shape of the turbine 10 tapers from the entrance aperture 20 to the exit component 30, the waveguide can focus a reduced divergence of the beam of such radiation waves. Characteristics of the waveguide are altered by different combinations of electrically conducting and insulating blades. The focus and/or width of the exiting wave can be altered by altering the size of the aperture A, which is achieved by extending or compressing the turbine 10, by moving the entrance aperture 20 and the exit component 30 relative to one another. The combination of concentrating fuel mixtures and focusing radiation waves to a concurrent point can advantageously provide a means of providing enhanced efficiency turbine engines. Alternatively, the control of gas, such as air, by the turbine 10 can be used simply to provide effective cooling to devices utilizing focused radiation beams. Okay, we are through the descriptions in the patent for this part. Let us summarize now. The implosive vortex waveguide is constructed with insulated blades or plates consisting of a paramagnetic or diamagnetic material in the center like copper, tungsten, stainless steel, and a dielectric material insulating this. So Malcolm uses polycarbonate and stainless steel in his design and the prototypes, I believe. But I believe that also copper can be used, and he mentions tungsten in the patent as well. So the material combination used here, along with the geometry, which is most important, the angles and the dimensions of the blades that make up the Vajra, they're all intended to produce the perfect waveguide. To trace out the perfect path for nature to take in her journey of least resistance. These counter-opposing blades, they form an intricate web, supporting one another mechanically. Although the Vajra structure can expand and contract as we discussed, it can move, it is incredibly mechanically strong because of the interlocking counter-opposing nature of its form. Energy can be directed efficiently by creating a physical feedback structure for nature herself to respond to. So we do this by copying nature. We utilize the sacred geometry of the Vajra. The aeroswell vane, situated around the waveguide, this is used to direct air or available forms of matter or fuel into the implosive vortex waveguide. And depending on how the Vajra drive is being used, this aeroswell vane can either be spinning or static, as was discussed in the patent. So as stated in the patent application earlier, in use the turbine 10 may be stationary or it may be rotated. Particularly, implementation is typically dependent on the environment in which the turbine 10 is being used. So for example, it's being used in water on land, then the turbine 10 is typically used spinning, rotating. The turbine 10 is used in a low pressure atmosphere, for example, in space, and the turbine 10 is typically used stationary or static. And atmospheric pressure, the turbine 10 may be used in a spinning or stationary manner. At the far left of the implosive vortex waveguide, we see the blades are individually wired so that they end up terminating in 4 electrodes. All facing inwards to the center point from northeast, south, and west. So if we take another look at this other diagram here, this quadrature firing assembly that we're talking about is situated between the contracting vortex, depicted in blue here within the implosive waveguide, and the counter-opposing expanding vortex depicted in red within the waveguide aperture control. So these vortexes are formed like a rope, many cords intertwined, fractal. So the air and matter, fuel, everything coming in, running along the blades, accumulates charge at these 4 inward pointing electrodes. And these are arranged in a negative, positive formation as shown here. The electrodes fire in quadrature towards their shared center point. And these discharges collide at the center point, and the plasmoids, which are formed at the center of the vortex, then fire out at a 90-degree angle to this. As according to the well-understood laws of electromagnetism that we probably already perhaps know. So this is described in the section charge source arrangement in the patent application. So let's have a quick look at that. Figure 13 illustrates an arrangement for directing a stream of charged particles, such as those passed through a turbine 10 as described above. In particular, figure 13 illustrates 4 sources of different charges, S1 to S4, arranged around and directed towards a single point. Each of the sources, S1 to S2, are arranged approximately 90 degrees to one another. The first source, S1, and the second source, S2, are located adjacent to one another, i.e. 90 degrees to one another, and both emit positive charge. The third source, S3, and the fourth source, S4, are located adjacent to one another, i.e. 90 degrees to one another, and opposite to sources S1 and S2, i.e. S3 is 180 degrees from the first source S1 and 90 degrees from the second source S2, and S4 is 180 degrees from the second source S2 and 90 degrees from the first source S1. Both the third source S3 and the fourth source S4 both emit negative charge. Arranging the charges in this quadratic configuration and directing them all to a single point can advantageously create a high-energy spark at that central point. Figures 14a and 14b illustrate an exemplary apparatus which helps to facilitate the charge source arrangement as illustrated in figure 13 and described above. In particular, figure 14a shows a schematic top view which includes line AB across the center of the apparatus 1000. Figure 14b shows a schematic cross-sectional view on which the line AB is indicated for reference. The apparatus 1000 comprises 4 parts, 1002, 1004, 1006, and 1008, which are configured to receive the 4 charge sources S1 to S4. The apparatus 1000 is formed as a sphere, and the 4 ports 1002, 1004, 1006, 1008 are located evenly around the diameter of the sphere, i.e. they are 90 degrees apart from one another. Simply by way of example, the first source S1 may be located at the first port 1002, the second source S2 located at the second port 1004, the third source S3 located at the third port 1006, the fourth source S4 located at the fourth port 1008. Between each of the ports 1002, 1004, 1006, 1008, and a central cavity 1010, there are provided channels 1012, 1014, 1016, 1018 along which the charge can travel. The charge can then meet at the central point located within the central cavity 1010. All right, that's a mouthful. There's a lot going on in this part of the process. Other fuel or waste matter, it can also be injected and utilized at this stage of the process too, if we wish. The implosive turbine can be used in a number of different ways, including not as a turbine at all, as we've mentioned. But essentially, all of this is done to establish an implosive vortex and provide plenty of available energy in its various forms to help kickstart and feed this vortex. The vortex, once established by the waveguide, becomes self-structuring, self-organizing, and self-perpetuating around a pole emanating around the 0 point of the model. This effect induces a vacuum. The airflow, which creates a clockwise imploding vortex, centralizes and compresses the air and fuel, which is then subsequently combusted when the blade, electrodes, fire in quadrature at the 0 point to create a fine tornado, which produces internal heat and an external vacuum. Moving on again, this is the last part, disregarding the cowling, shown in the original diagrams from Malcolm's how-to presentation, which we're showing here. And it's pretty much another whole invention on its own. The specific instruction is not specified. There is some photographs of some prototypes, but we are given some details as to what its job is and what it is here to perform.
Our electron scavenging plasmoid drive creates holographic zero matter, which is to say it generates all frequencies, therefore it emits direct current, which is no frequency. This represents the 360-degree, 0-degree paradigm. This drive is based on the framework of our model of the elements and is achieved by placing 3-part copper coils at the elemental nodal positions and passing neodymium magnets through each coil's aperture in sequential progression. The resulting pulses release electrons, which are harvested using our plasmoid medium. This is both a mechanical drive and an electron scavenger. The individual frequencies are a consequence of the magnet's fixed rate of progression over an expanding distance. The electromagnetic pulsing through the coils, with a differentially expanding spacing determined by phi on our plasmoid pi surface between the coil's elemental locations, generates all the elemental frequencies and therefore combine to produce none. Again, the 360-degree 0-degree paradigm. The zero-point monopolar collision created by our implosive vortex waveguide causes opposite spirals to collide in quadrature and in sequence, therefore maintaining a large zero-point center and 16 peripheral zero points at the implosive vortex waveguide's equatorial plane. This enables the zero matter plane to be tapped and therefore harnessed as an energy source. The purpose of the scavenger unit is to facilitate a closed feedback loop. By harvesting the free electrons and recirculating both the DC and AC charge, this sustains the discharge in quadrature required by the implosive vortex waveguide turbine, enabling the engine's operation in both submarine and space environments.
So this is the electric scavenger control or frequency scavenger control unit. This is situated below the aperture control, also surrounding the fire tornado output. So you'll notice that this looks a lot like Malcolm's toroidal model of the elements, but as far as I understand, this is actually an apparatus consisting of geometrically arranged and finely tuned copper coils, or a single coil that's designed to efficiently capture and utilize a broad spectrum of frequencies using fractal geometric considerations. So this is arranged as per their designation according to Malcolm's model. Frequency will only report to a maximum of 32 planes, 64 points. Each element or each frequency band can be mapped to one of these points. The electric scavenger control, or the frequency scavenger control unit, is its function to some extent. It's here to harvest and reuse any of the stray harmonics that would be otherwise wasted as vibration, heat, or other losses, or become disruptions in the device. So it's designed not just to prevent energy loss, but to harvest and to make use of the manifestations of energy that would generally we would want to actually avoid in the system anyway. So this works in the same way that a prism splits up light, only it deals with a broader spectrum of frequencies. So an easy way to demonstrate how this could work using a much less esoteric and more widely understood example is to just quickly explain using a Tesla coil circuit, the nature of harmonics. So in this way, we can explore the consideration of how harmonics can be captured and utilized, and we should be doing this. So if we have a standard Tesla coil circuit, we have a standard power input. So this could be a DC battery in this case. This is what we use in the example. And this is connected to a transformer. A transformer generally consists of two smaller insulated copper coils wrapped around an iron core, and they can be used to transform current into voltage or vice versa, to keep it simple. So in this case, we convert our DC input current into a high voltage, low current AC signal. And this is used to charge and discharge a capacitor. These small pulses of power, they allow the spark gap to electrodes placed very close together to arc, closing the circuit. And there's more complex replacements for the spark gap these days that are mostly used, such as transistors or MOSFETs, but the function remains essentially the same, forming and collapsing magnetic fields. Anyway, this is all occurring to excite the primary coil so that it will resonate at its natural resonant frequency, the frequency which the coil itself has been intentionally tuned to. The spark gap and the capacitor are also optimally tuned for this purpose to make the coil resonate. When the primary coil resonates, we're now really in the realms of science that can be better understood through the physics of tuning forks. Sympathetic resonance will occur in the secondary coil, which is inductively coupled with the primary coil. The secondary coil resonates in sympathy because it's generally tuned to exactly the same frequency as the primary coil, with adjustments made to account for the circuitry. The secondary coil is generally made from a far higher gauge, thinner, longer coil of wire than the secondary coil, and in this way, extremely high voltage output can be produced if a top load or an output circuit is added to the secondary coil, as Nikola Tesla is seen doing in his photos with the lightning coming out. But what most electrical engineers seem to miss, and certainly the curriculum of electrical engineering definitely seems to skip over, at least in the standard textbooks in regard to the LC circuit, pertains to harmonics. When we hear a note played when a string is plucked, it sounds just like we hear one frequency, right? One note sounding. But what we're identifying is just the fundamental frequency of the complete harmonic series that's being produced. So one note is made up of many harmonics. It's fractal, many frequencies, which can be mathematically calculated. So this same idea can be applied to Tesla coils. A coil tuned to, for example, 432,000 hertz or cycles per second does not only resonate at 432,000 hertz, there's also a fractal harmonic series of frequencies simultaneously resonating, which can be mathematically determined from the fundamental. So we have a primary and secondary coil, both tuned to 432,000 hertz. So this is the fundamental harmonic being utilized in this example Tesla coil circuit. But if we wanted to utilize the harmonics, potential energy that currently just goes to waste in our electrical infrastructure, they call it back EMF or EMF, waste energy, we could tune individual coils to capture each frequency in the harmonic series or each range of frequencies from the fundamental, and we could place these smaller coils around the primary coil along with the secondary. So these coils, tuned to the full harmonic series of the primary, or at least as far into the series as is practical and useful, can capture the full spectrum of frequency of AC energy that would otherwise just go to waste or even be the cause of interference problems in the circuit. So let's think a step further than this. Instead of just having separate coils tuned to each harmonic, why not invent a fractal coil structure where these functions of all these miniature tuned harmonic coils are integrated into one larger structure? This is not that hard. How could we arrange such a structure then? We're back to Malcolm Bendel's Vajra and toroidal model of the elements. Frequencies report to a maximum of 32 planes, 16 mirror planes, 64 points. So it will only report to these planes. If we go back to consider the electron scavenger control or frequency scavenger control in the Vajra implosive turbine, I believe that this illustrates at least one aspect of what Malcolm's doing here. There's way more to it. I do not currently have the details myself to be able to share anything more about this yet, but it involves neodymium magnets and a fair bit more complexity than what I've included in this simplified illustrative example. But for now, I'm still just trying to build a mental bridge myself to better understand the fundamental processes of nature in any way I can. So at any rate, Malcolm is using this module to capture and reutilize any straight frequencies, anything that would usually just end up causing overheating, interference, vibration, whatever, EMF. So he's splitting these up and recycling the harmonics, recombining these back into a structured AC electrical signal to in turn recharge the capacitor banks or another part of the turbine. And here we see a simplified model of the complete unit, the fire tornado used for propulsion shown. We talked about earlier the insane levels of thrust that can be generated. And that about sums up our explanation of the fundamental processes occurring here. As I say, this is not just a turbine. It can also be employed to synthesize new elements such as gold, as per our examples earlier. The Vajra is also employed in the Bendel Tesla World Power Plant design, where it will provide an ionized stream of plasmoids to connect a column of argon in a granite mountain to the Earth's ionosphere through the Schumann cavity. So this is another topic on its own, but in this way we can generate unlimited clean electricity, which can be harnessed through tuned aerials anywhere on Earth. You can find a little bit about this in Malcolm's lecture series already. We can also find some photographs of Malcolm's prototypes in the slideshows from his lectures. Just show a couple of these slides here. You can see some of the modules that we've explored already labeled here in different arrangements, arranged for various tests. And I won't go through these parts specifically again. You can pause to take a look at any of these photos if you wish, and you can also find them in Malcolm's PowerPoint presentation, which is made open source and freely available on HowTube. And there is just one last thing that I want to take a look at before we finish up for today. The final two slides in Malcolm Bendel's 237 slide PowerPoint shows a quite curious design. And this is of course a simplified model of what we would generally just like to refer to as a craft. The Vajra implosive turbine or direct matter to energy drive is situated at the center. And we see several layers like a toroidal disc onion. We see the form of a plasmoid, of course. The infinity figure 8 can be seen in the cross section here again in the second diagram too. We see the flow guide for two opposing vortexes extended from the geometry of the warp drive to the geometry of the craft. Air, matter, plasma, ether, whatever is vacuumed into the so-called gravity well formed at the plane of equilibrium between the two vortexes at the point of the aperture below the implosive vortex waveguide, as we already discussed, will follow this flow guide. So the craft is just an extension of the drive's geometry, designed to amplify and work in harmony with these same processes. The gray panels forming the central ring overlapping the inner layer in yellow, these can be opened or closed. Imagine these hinged panels like petals at both the bottom and top of the craft, able to open and close like lotus flowers. In this way, we can steer, accelerate, and de-accelerate the craft. As we've discussed, the calculated level of available thrust that can be produced by the turbine in the implosive fire tornado is astronomically high. We harness the sacred geometric structure of the toroid again here to direct the enormous amount of thrust generated by the turbine as we wish. If we wish to store the energy temporarily, then the petals can be opened. Enormous amounts of potential energy can be safely stored in motion, as long as we provide an appropriate endless racetrack that nature will always want to stick to anyway. This is the toroid, the 3D infinity sign. When the petals are opened up, the racetrack is clear and we can safely store huge amounts of potential energy in toroidal orbit. When the petals are closed, all of this potential energy can be employed for thrust. When some are closed and some are open, we can direct this thrust and therefore the directional movement of the craft. Simple, elegant. That's all I have to say on the matter for now. For my own peace of mind, I would like to categorically state that this is all I know about this particular implementation of the turbine. These two slides that are already available publicly and the short descriptions I have shared, the actual implementation of this technology is for a later date. For now, we need to practically engineer and retrofit the Thunderstorm generator to all of our existing vehicles and infrastructure first. We need a transition period, but we need it to begin now. A transition where everybody wins and nobody freaks out. Much more on the Thunderstorm generator development and testing coming soon. Remember that you will be able to come and see it demonstrated live at Cosmic Summit this June 15th to 17th, and the links are in the description as usual. Please remember that I'm working completely open source and independent. You are welcome to share anything from my videos without asking in the effort to help get this out there to the world on a greater scale. Not to attack me or something bad, then you're not welcome. But if you do wish to help my effort, you can donate to the channel also. Link in the description. Thank you to everyone who has already donated. It really means a lot. It can't be going. It can't be available to do insanely long videos like this on insanely complex topics. But also keep in mind that the protection patent itself has, of course, been submitted for the invention. The patent documents and most of the visual resources I gathered to use in this video are the intellectual property of Strike Foundation and Malcolm Bendall. So this applies internationally. You obviously cannot try and patent any of this yourself or claim it offers your own invention or anything like that. That's why this is being done.